We've been talking about movies on YouTube for about 7 years now, and 2024 was the first year where I felt a bit overwhelmed with the amount of horror movies that were coming out. I mean, every year there's a lot of new horror movies that come out, of course, but this year specifically, I felt there was an above average volume of good ones, and it was very varied. You got slashers, body horror, gothic horror, comedy horror, slow burn thrillers, I mean for all kinds of tastes and appetites. I think in part we're seeing one of the side effects of streaming services, where movies are able to find more sources of distribution. But even the theatrical releases were very strong, so maybe we just had a lucky year. So if it was hard for me to keep up, someone who usually has a close eye on festivals and keeps his letterbox lists up to date, then I can see why it would be difficult for anyone who just wants to find a good horror movie to sit down and watch and is staggered by the choices. So today, my brother and I wanted to take a look at all the horror movies we saw from the past year, break them down into 6 categories, and let you know which ones you should definitely watch and the ones you should avoid, starting with the latter. This category only has one movie, because I actively avoid watching bad movies. I, like most of you, prefer not to sit down and waste money and time on fruitless endeavors, so I usually read reviews, look at what people are saying, and try to make informed choices. But the only time I go in blind for a movie is when I go to a film festival. It's like a roll of the dice. Sometimes you find a hidden gem, and other times you end up watching the first movie of this list, The Beast Within. Okay, so as proof of how our minds like to filter out bad memories, I had actually forgotten I had seen this werewolf tale. Which is weird to say because I actually went out to go watch this movie at a festival with the director sitting just a few rows in front of me. And let me tell you, it's not a good sign when people start laughing at your first title card. Honestly, Kit Harington didn't do a bad job here. It's really the story that was underwhelming. We follow a family living on the outskirts. The daughter notices her father undergoes a mysterious routine ever so often, where he is taken to a forest to spend the whole night out, and comes back in the morning all bloody. She finds out the family's secret. Her father is a werewolf. You know, on paper it doesn't sound like a bad idea. It just had a very underwhelming execution. It felt long and drawn out with unnecessary story elements and a soundtrack that was trying really hard to add emotion. They start tying the lore of the werewolf with a metaphor for an abusive relationship, which I think is a good way of going with it. But when the metaphor started being more literal, it just felt so on the nose. This sadly felt like a waste of time. It wasn't enjoyable, it took itself too seriously, and showed a lack of self-awareness. Not a self-werewolf.
Next up are the movies we feel had the potential of being good, but somewhere along the way they either just fell apart, or they couldn't really deliver on the premise they had promised. First up is Mads, a French zombie movie that tries to differentiate itself from all of the other zombie movies by the way it's made. One long continuous shot. Yes, the whole movie. That is very impressive, and it sounds incredibly difficult to do. So for the whole movie, you're seeing a zombie apocalypse through the different POVs of people caught in the confusion and horror of what is happening on this crazy night. And there are parts here that really work. But this is one instance where I feel the filming style goes against what they were trying to do. You see, wonders are best used to feel like they're capturing a real moment. Anything the actors are doing is magnified. This is where details can really come to life in a way that is lost in a heavily edited scene. You give space for the actor to act, but here it works against the movie because instead of showing spontaneity, it magnifies just how on strict guardrails this project had to be maintained. There are a lot of moments where you feel like the actors are just buying time for the next scene or set up to be ready so that they can move from point A to point B. They repeat a lot of dialogue and heave and moan to help drag things out. But I think if you're not a French speaker, you might not notice it as much. But 2 scenes specifically come to mind. The first one happens early on when a woman starts attacking the main character while he's driving. Of course the actor has to keep going to the next checkpoint, but logically the character would have stopped the car. The second is when one of the characters has a friend biting her neck on a motorcycle. Again, you would think she would have just stopped or pushed her off, but no. She just asks, "Why are you biting? What's going on?" Or even before she's gotten on the bike, she could have made a bigger deal as to why she was covered in so much blood in the first place. There were just a lot of moments like that where you're asked to maintain your suspension of disbelief, but I felt like it was just too much, although I do respect the effort. The second movie I felt disappointed with is one that spoils its own story with the marketing. Abigail. I think a group of criminals that kidnap a little girl only to find out she's a vampire is a really good premise. But as you watch the movie, it really feels like that detail was supposed to be played out as a reveal. For the most part, Abigail is enjoyable, comedic, and entertaining. But it feels like the last 15 minutes were written by someone else, or they got a script note that added another storyline. It felt unnecessary. Plus, by the end, they were trying to create sympathy for the villain. And some of the decisions just felt out of character. If this movie would have ended earlier, it would have ranked a bit higher. But nope.
The same can be said about the next disappointing movie on this list, Immaculate. I like religious horror, and I felt this could be something at least interesting, even if these types of movies are usually mashups of The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. A young nun joining a convent in Italy and discovering a dark secret is nothing original. I mean, there was another movie that came out just a few months later with the same exact premise. So I had low expectations already, but what sucks is that there are moments here that felt like it could have been good. And I also liked the muted cinematography. Also, Sydney Sweeney, she did a good job and her freakout towards the end was really striking, nice and primal. Maybe just watch that part, because it's the best thing in the whole movie. It's too bad the story takes a nonsensical nosedive in a lower tier horror movie kind of way. Next up is another movie I went in blindly because it was at a film festival. Azrael. I liked the premise, and it has Samara Weaving, who I really liked in Ready or Not. And she ends up very bloody in this one as well. So it's about a woman who is escaping a cult, and it takes place after an apocalyptic event. The survivors have renounced speaking, because it draws the attention of these zombie-like demons, similar rules to A Quiet Place. So this cult wants to capture her so they can sacrifice her to appease an ancient evil. The rules of this world aren't very clear because a lot of the movie relies on what is conveyed with expressions, and the clues you can see around the characters, to which I feel Samara did a good job of emoting without the use of dialogue. It had a lot of good scene ideas that are built like these good pressure cooker situations, but as a story, I just felt confused with a lot of the rules of this post-apocalyptic world. It just felt like they could have given a bit more information or gotten the movie's lore ironed out, because some events feel like they didn't connect with what they were setting up. Now, it wasn't terrible, surprisingly gory, but you're just left with this feeling of, this could have been worked out more. But the most disappointing movie for me on this list was one that I saw a lot of people were hyping up, Strange Darlings. And for the most part, I thought this movie was going to be good. It felt dynamic, it felt inventive. I like how the movie starts with chapter 3 and then it continues with a non-linear fashion. A bloodied woman running away from a man with a shotgun. And initially, there's no dialogue. Every bit of context is given to you by the action you see on screen and the assumptions you create in your head. Then, usually the following non-sequential chapter subverts the context you just created. That part was really good, and I was really rooting for this movie. Good cinematography, well-directed action, but there's a point in the movie where the audience gets up to date with the context, and the tables are turned. Now it's the audience that knows more than the characters, and that's where things start to fall apart. It stops being clever and it becomes predictable for the last quarter of the movie. It overstays its welcome and undoes what it was building. Once there's more dialogue, you realize what was really working for this movie was the action. The message of the movie becomes very on the nose, and it's too bad. I feel the direction was better than the writing, and what was making this movie feel clever was just the non-linear editing that naturally creates mystery. It's hard not to recommend this because there's a lot of good stuff here, but you might not be satisfied with the ending.
Thankfully, we are done with the more clearly negative entries on the list, and we can move on to the films that felt average. And I want to start with one that I think a lot of people will be interested in watching once it gets a theatrical release, Shelby Oaks, made by one of the biggest reviewers on this platform, Chris Duckman. So I went into this with tempered expectations. I think Chris is a good reviewer whose appreciation for movies always shines through in his videos. But I remember seeing one of his short films, and truth be told, I did not like it at all. I was wondering if this movie was going to be just a further example of that, or if he was going to show real growth as a filmmaker. And thankfully, the movie is a decent semi-found footage story with a lot of good ideas, but not all of them have enough time to get fully developed. The story centers around a character looking for her missing sister that disappeared with her group of paranormal YouTube investigators. All she has to go on is the last bit of footage they found of her before she might have gotten killed. I think one of the main drawbacks of the story is that it's mostly plot-driven, getting from point A to point B, eventually leading to where the mystery ends, but this made a lot of character decisions and possible emotional moments suffer for the sake of unraveling the mystery. All in all, this was a very good directorial debut. It wasn't a half-hearted effort at all. I feel like he's really shown growth from his earlier short films.
Another movie I felt was okay was the Canadian folk horror called The King Tide. It's about this small, calm fishing town in Newfoundland, where the inhabitants' lives are changed when they discover a mysterious child with powers. At first, she's able to bring good fortune to the town, but problems arise when the inhabitants start feeling they should be the ones to decide how the girl's powers should be used. And it all just evolves from there. It felt like a simple story. Some might see it as slow or bland, but it was a nice understated folk horror from a place I usually don't see a lot of movies from. I also gave it bonus points because it's Canadian.
Moving to something that wasn't understated for most of the year is the highly anticipated and much talked about Longlegs. I feel like a lot of people will be surprised to find this movie in the just okay tier, but after rewatching it, I feel like it really deserves to be here. Looking back, Longlegs was one of the horror movies I was the most looking forward to. I felt very interested after watching the teaser.
911, what's your emergency?
It's not my daughter.
And that by itself makes you feel like, oh, what's this movie about? Also matched with the crime scene pictures, it almost felt like they were making a found footage supernatural mystery. And later the reveal that Nicolas Cage was going to be in the movie felt like the cherry on top of the genre movie sundae. After watching the end result, I feel like the director is very good at giving us creepy visuals and giving us a villain that can make your skin crawl because of its near-pained, high-pitched squeal, but I felt that ultimately there was something missing narratively. Something happens around the third act that feels out of place, or at least it made things become a bit more supernatural than what I felt the movie had set up. You kinda just have to go along with it, and even on my second viewing of the movie, I still felt like it didn't really square right with me. I even realized that a lot of the movie's initial tension or suspense depends a lot on what the mystery could be. But once you already know that, some scenes just feel long. Of course, one could say that about any movie, but take Silence of the Lambs, a story that is in this movie's DNA. The scenes are just naturally tense and don't depend on the overall mystery. Sadly, I feel this movie suffers from its own marketing. It just created an expectation that couldn't really be met. Overall, I think it worked against them.
Now back to a movie that less people were talking about. Sleep, a South Korean film about something that I sometimes fear could happen as I sleep next to my wife. Imagine you wake up next to your partner and they're talking in their sleep, saying ominous things, sleepwalking, sleep eating, and even scratching their face to the degree that they start drawing blood. It's a disturbing premise. That's what these characters have to go through until things escalate and become even more dangerous. Truth be told, I didn't feel any sort of way with this movie. It just felt okay. I like the relationship of the couple, how it deteriorates, and how gradually we see that there is a supernatural reasoning behind all of this. But I felt things got an easy explanation, something which took away from the mystery it was building. Not much else to say about it. Give it a watch if you can find it. Although they do this one thing that I dislike that they do in movies where they talk about something that happens off screen that would have been very interesting to see. Anyway.
On paper, the following movie should have been a home run for me. Exuma is a Korean horror movie about supernatural investigators that are contracted to help end a wealthy family's generational curse. And of course, after doing some grave digging, things don't go as planned because the ancient evils had other ideas. Sounds exciting, right? The thing is, I actually forgot about this movie when I was preparing the video. It's not that it was a bad film, but I felt that it was very convoluted with twists and turns that sure were surprising, but in the end didn't leave a lasting impression. Some moments were cool, like the ones with the gigantic samurai creature, but unfortunately, I don't see myself revisiting it anytime soon.
Switching to a movie that I heard a lot of good things about, Red Rooms. And the fact that this is a Quebec movie filmed in Montreal filled me with a special kind of pride. It's a cool feeling to watch a movie and keep saying at every point, oh, I know that place. I use that metro station. I know those local actors. What we get in this movie is the portrait of a woman that is heavily obsessed with the case of a serial killer in Montreal. She lives for this case, like a person who would be excited about their favorite sports team. following it constantly and getting up early to get good seats to be in the courtroom, and knowing everything about the alleged murderer. She's fanatical and obviously in some kind of spectrum, and even inserting herself in the investigation. What I like about this is how morbid this movie can be without showing anything, and how tense the opening continuous uninterrupted scene is with just giving the information about the case. There's something very Fincheresque about the direction, and how things feel like a slow and precise twisting of a knife. But apart from the direction and tone, the drawback I find is in the characterization of the protagonist. It felt a bit flat. We didn't get much access to her as a person. And there isn't much here when it comes to narrative. But I think for other people that won't really get in the way of enjoying the movie.
Okay, 10 down, and now we move on to the movies I felt were above average, those that were more than just okay and actually turned into something good. I want to start with a film I felt was the hardest one to watch from all the ones on this list, The Devil's Bath. Don't let the name fool you. This is a historical horror movie with nothing supernatural in it, and honestly, it's one of those movies I won't rewatch because it's just very sad. A young woman in 1750s Austria has just gotten married, and what is supposed to be a happy new chapter in her life becomes marred with disappointment, disapproval, and despair. It's a simple story of a woman afflicted with a deepening depression, but because in those days everything bad had to have a supernatural connotation, she is misdiagnosed with being possessed. People that were dealing with depression back then were said to be in the devil's bath, and the more they try to treat her, the more despondent and unhinged she becomes. Honestly, this movie is a cold shower that fills you with the sobering weight of knowledge that this used to happen to a lot of people who lived with depression. This movie is bleak, and it doesn't need anything supernatural to haunt you. Now, if you need a palate cleanser, the next movie on the list will do the trick. It's What's Inside is what I imagine the screenwriter might have come up with after a thought experiment regarding how you make a movie based on the board game Guess Who. We find this group of, let's say, friends reuniting before one of them is about to get married. They decide to play around with an experiment that one of their estranged friends brought from work. This machine can switch people into someone else's body, and then insanity ensues. I think this is a movie that has a lot of fun with its premise, and before you start to get bored with it, it manages to up the ante and raises the stakes. It felt very inventive, it has a lot of style, and I like how they came up with the idea of how to tell people apart with the different colored filters. This was a good comedy that was meant to be exaggerated and convoluted.
But if you want something even more convoluted, you should definitely watch House of Sayuri. It's a Japanese haunted house movie directed by Koji Shiraishi, the man who made one of my all-time favorite Japanese horror movies, Noroi. Here things start out as you would expect from a typical haunted house movie. A family moves in, strange things start to happen, and a strange entity makes itself known. And some of the scares are creepy and downright cruel. No one in this family is safe. And as the movie continues, things get even more serious. Until it becomes a self-aware parody of haunted house movies, completely shifting in tone. It goes from horror to comedy to the absurd and serious again. But the finale was straight up from an anime. It was a complete roller coaster, and it threw away any expectations of what I thought was going to happen next. And I like that. Although I do admit that my level of enjoyment might have been influenced by the festival crowd that I was with. Everyone was just having such a good time, so I do wonder what your level of enjoyment would be with this movie. In any case, I think it's a worthwhile ride.
This next one is a more well-known selection, and apparently it's considered one of the scariest movies of 2024. Or at least that's what the eye-catching headlines will have you believe. Oddity. A lot of people were recommending this movie, but as much as I enjoyed the gothic horror mystery revenge tale, I feel like it was a bit overhyped. One thing I found it really did well were the scares. I think the writer-director is really good at coming up with chilling situations to put his characters in, and he purposely designs his scenes to freak out the audience. And he does it in a simple but effective way. Case in point, the opening scene. Just receiving an unknown guest in the middle of the night, asking you to open the door. I also like the design of the monstrous wood statue, which is very creepy. But if I can offer some criticism, if a random family member comes to your house with this grotesque thing, I don't think anyone would let it in. I mean, just look at it. Anyone would think that could come alive. I was really expecting someone to point that out, or to show a bigger hesitation towards it. It's so weird, but I guess we wouldn't have a movie if it was acknowledged. How maddeningly convenient.
Going from a movie with a lot of scares to one with none is a different man. It's one of those movies that is not completely horror, but has enough body horror elements to make it horror adjacent. We follow a man that feels he cannot live a normal life or continue his dream of being an actor because he's disfigured. Not wanting to continue living a life where he feels he needs to hide himself, he gets an advanced treatment to transform himself into a tall glass of Sebastian Stan. He later encounters a man with the same condition, but he is taken aback with how he is constantly and unknowingly one-upping him in everything in life. His relationships, his acting career, and just his overall enjoyment of existing. I found this movie to be funny and off-kilter in an understated way. This movie is played like an absurd joke on the main character, to make him understand that what he has to transform isn't an external perception but an internal one. I don't think there's a deep read into this story, but I felt it was a quirky and ironic execution.
Next up is a musically adjacent, dark romantic horror comedy about connecting with your inner rage. Your monster. Laura has been through hell. She was diagnosed with cancer. Her musical theater boyfriend broke up with her and is casting someone else for the part she was supposed to play. And of course, there's a monster living inside her closet, threatening to kick her out of her childhood home. It's very enjoyable to follow Laura and the monster's relationship as they begin to connect and gradually become more than just friends, which in turn helps empower her and helps her to assert herself in a way that she wasn't able to before. It presents itself as a modern-day Beauty and the Beast, and I think that's where the movie is at its strongest and most charming. But my main gripe is that when the movie decides to serve as the metaphor of the story, it then no longer explores its own delightful premise. Ultimately, it's a fun and quirky watch.
Now, for a movie that fools you to come inside with its charm and into a religious horror, it's Heretic. Two young LDS members arrive at the home of a person looking to know more about their religion. But little do they know that they have stepped into a welcoming but sinister trap that will test their faith and most likely take their lives. For the most part, this had a really tense atmosphere. I really liked the first scenes where they're sitting down in the living room, just talking. The dialogue just did a good job of making everything be on pins and needles. How the villain is slowly intruding with the words he uses. It's like he's testing their boundaries, and whenever he might be crossing a line, his charm just manages to deflate the situation. I think throughout, Hugh Grant just manages to tap into this very polite villain that rarely comes off as evil until it's too late. Where I think the movie falters is when conveniences start to happen, and that lessens the moments when the story was being clever. Also, there's a very long and thorough explanation that felt like it could have been cut down. And I get it, the writer is trying to make a point, but I feel at some point it's being telegraphed. In any case, I think it's a really good watch.
Up next is a slasher made by a couple of YouTubers, Milk and Cereal. I've watched many of Curry and Coop's sketches on Instagram and was pleasantly surprised to see that they made a horror movie on their YouTube channel. It's about a birthday prank gone wrong that escalates and creates deadly consequences. The fact that the movie was made for less than $1,000 helps add to the enjoyment because since it's a found footage film, it already looks raw and real and to a certain point, makes you question how much was scripted if you're already aware that it's made by YouTubers whose sketches often involve pranks. In addition to being a solid short horror film, it can also be a source of inspiration for any aspiring filmmaker that doesn't have much in terms of budget or equipment to do a movie with.
Okay, before we get into the movies that we felt were top tier, I want to take some time to look at a movie that I felt was incredibly dumb, but also incredibly enjoyable. And it came out of one night when my wife, out of nowhere, wanted to watch a movie that had a shark in it. Having just seen Jaws, I looked up what Netflix had to offer. And in fact, they had just recently put up a shark movie called Under Paris. Just listen to this synopsis. In order to save Paris from an international bloodbath, a grieving scientist is forced to face her tragic past when a giant shark appears in the Seine. It's an incredibly dumb concept, and I was like, okay, I can turn off my brain. Sure, I can bite. What I like about the movie is that it felt like it was written by someone who knew this was an insane task, and at every point that something didn't make sense, they somehow came up with a reason said with enough confidence to make it sound logical. Wait, why is there a shark in the Seine of Paris? Because of global warming or something. But how can a shark survive in the river? Well, obviously it managed to evolve and exist anywhere, duh. You know, to me it seems simple. If we want to avoid a bloodbath, why don't we just close off the river? Well, because the mayor just planned a triathlon and there's just no going back from that now, is there? Another thing I appreciated is that the actors were playing this so seriously. Not for a second do they let up on how nonsensical everything is. But what made it extra insane and good is when you realize the shark is basically the Joker from The Dark Knight. Always one step ahead of everyone, wreaking havoc upon the city and holding it for ransom. Now this is a shark with a plan. Again, this is stupid, but it's so bad it's actually good. So make an evening out of it. Get your cinephile friends or anyone with a good sense of humor, and point at every stupid bombastic decision and have a good laugh. Okay, enough with that. Let's get to the good stuff, or at least the movies we feel you should definitely watch. I want to start with the shortest movie on this list. It's about 45 minutes long actually, and it's called Chime. I was interested in this because it was made by the director of Cure and Pulse. He's good at creating these movies with a heavy feeling of dread, and building this atmosphere where you feel like something bad can happen at any moment. The same is true for this film. There is a sense of unease on the frame, but also in the characters. Like something is boiling under the surface. This movie makes me think of a Junji Ito story, because the element of horror is introduced by a simple disruption in someone's life. Here it's the sound of a chime that one of the students of the main character says he keeps hearing. And then, like a subtle curse, this internal disruption spreads onto the protagonist and other people in the story until they lash out violently. I like how the director is able to create a feeling of uncertainty, how a plain look can be threatening, and how silence can be unstill. Now I want to talk about an Indian folk horror chamber piece filmed in black and white called Brahmayugam. The story of a slave that arrives at a desolate palace. He's hungry, tired, and asks for help. The owner takes pity on him and shows him mercy. The slave decides to serve the man as a singer to show him gratitude. But little does he know that this refuge will become his new cage, and his now master is hiding his true nature. I'm not someone who has a lot of good reference points for Indian movies or Indian folklore, so it was very interesting to see this tale of greed unravel. I didn't feel confused with it. I think it does a good job of presenting its lore. I like the main character's plight to escape and trick his master to find his freedom. It had really solid monochromatic cinematography with very eye-pleasing shots. If you want to watch something that's different from our North American sensibilities, then do give this a shot. I know a lot of people might be put off by moments of singing or dramatic close-ups, but if you take a look at all the horror movies that came out in 2024, many had elaborate dances and song numbers. So are we really that far off?
Next on the list, a found footage film that proves that David Dastmalchian can be much more than just a character actor and can be a compelling lead. Late Night with the Devil. Jack Delroy is the host of a Tonight Show type program in the 70s. The show has poor ratings, so to help boost them, Jack plans to have some special guests on a Halloween-themed episode. The movie is the recovered footage of that night's broadcast. First off, the production team did a good job at making everything look like it belonged in the late 70s, and making it feel like this is a show that could have very well existed 50 years ago. The established realism within the talk show context helps add a layer of tension as things start to go down a weird and supernatural path, and makes it all the more shocking once it really hits the fan. Again, David does a great job shouldering this movie, going from warm, charismatic, and endearing to small, desperate, and scared in such a short amount of time. A man not just losing control of his show, but of himself in the process. Overall, it's enjoyable, has a few laughs, a few solid scares, and should definitely be checked out.
Moving into something else that felt foreign because of the subject matter and oddly nostalgic is I Saw the TV Glow. Two troubled teenagers bond over their love for a Buffy-esque TV show, but the protagonist begins to realize that his attraction to the series might have a deeper meaning, and he starts to question his reality. Most of the aesthetic of I Saw the TV Glow feels like a half-remembered memory, mixed with late-night 90s TV, hazy and hard to put into words, much like the main character's struggle. This felt very intimate, like looking through the window of someone else's pain, and a pain I'm not familiar with, and that most people will never have to know. I was very saddened by it. I think this is one of the movies that succeeds in using filmmaking to create empathy. This one really stuck with me. I think on the technical side, the director is still getting there. But when it comes to placing the audience in another person's shoes, I think it does something special. It's a different kind of horror, a very personal and hidden one, that can even be hard for someone to come to grips with. Now moving on to something lighter but gruesome is Alien Romulus. Now, I'm surprised to see that a lot of film critics that I respect didn't like this movie, but I have to disagree with them because I really had a good time watching it. I went into this movie with no expectations. I didn't know if I was going to get something lore building like Prometheus or a reimagining of Alien, and it turns out it's a bit of a cinematic potpourri that grabs the best ideas of the franchise and revisits them to create something new, familiar, and fun. I think as an audience member, that's what I wanted. A new installment with fun, bloody kills with a familiar lore. And I enjoyed it, and the people in my theater seemed to like it as well. As my brother put it in his review, it's a fun haunted house in space. And I want more of that. Now, one of the movies I was really looking forward to this year, made by a director I really respect because of his adherence to authenticity, is Nosferatu. But I was worried because I was wondering if this was going to be a rethread of past Nosferatu and Dracula stories. I was really hoping this could offer something new, and for the most part, I think it did. I think the actors really brought their A-game to this one. Lily Rose Depp's possessed gesticulation could make anyone flinch. It was such a good physical performance from her and Nicholas Hoult, who did an amazing job of looking frightened for his life. But I think the main thing I loved about the movie was the look. A lot of the shots looked as if they were being robbed of color, or one could say being robbed of life. Dark and grim images, with just barely any light. I liked that shot of the shadowy hand over the city. I think Robert Eggers was straddling the line between being realistic to vampire folk stories and paying tribute to the works that came before him, which explains some of the more theatrical acting decisions in the movie. My big problem with Nosferatu, and I think this is a personal issue, is that I think Count Orlok looks like Jim Carrey playing Dr. Robotnik in the Sonic movies, and I cannot shake that out of my head. I could not stop thinking about that. And yes, I get it, it's how a noble person would have looked in those times. Yeah, whatever. To me, it looks a lot like him, and unfortunately, I found it funny in moments where it was supposed to be scary, but again, this is just me. I would not put this higher than The Witch though, but it's still really good.
Now for a film that I was not expecting for it to be rated too high up on this list. Smile 2. The first Smile was an okay movie. A by-the-numbers demon curse horror story with some good uncanny imagery and effective scares for the most part. And then comes Smile 2, which just builds upon all that and states, hey, that was just practice. This is what I really wanted to do. And listen, the director could have done something very similar to the original and maintained the formula, just spooking people with creepy faces, but he didn't. He made the story feel bigger, but still centered on one character that you really root for to make it out alive from this evil curse. Naomi Scott performs her brains out. She sings, she dances, she snot cries, and loses her mind like it's nobody's business. This was another good theater experience where the crowd was very engaged, energized, and freaking out at a lot of moments. I do think it suffers from what feels like reusing elements from the previous movie, but there is just so much good here that I think it overshadows the bad. This is a fun, gory, accessible horror movie that really shines with its protagonist.
Okay, now time for one of the biggest surprises to make it on this list, The First Omen. And one of the reasons why it's in this tier is because it had no business being this good. On paper, this should have been a dud that nobody would have even remembered come the end of the year. An unnecessary prequel to a franchise that's barely standing up. Plus, like I mentioned before, you got another movie with the same synopsis coming out the same year, just a few months apart. What are we doing here? But hey, last year was a decent year for prequels, so I was surprised when I heard reviewers telling people to give this one a shot. And it was good. It had a solid opening scene that reassured me that I was in for a good ride, and that I was in the hands of a capable filmmaker. It has some pretty creepy imagery, and shows just enough without it being too overly graphic. But what I loved was the acting of the main character. In a lot of religious movies, you see a certain caricature of the way this type of character gets portrayed. I liked that it didn't feel like that here. I really liked her transformation from a wide-eyed devout nun to someone that's losing their mind, and she has a stunning acting moment here. Like, I don't think it's the best horror movie, but it had so much going against it, and that's why I put it up in this tier, because it succeeded in doing so much well.
I didn't know anything about the following movie. What really piqued my interest was its long title, Humanist Vampire Seeking Consenting Suicidal Person. When I looked into it and saw that it was made in Quebec, it made me want to watch it even more. Sacha has always been compassionate, which is why she can't bring herself to kill in order to feed, like her family does. Once her parents cut her off, she needs to figure out how to hunt, even when her performance anxiety prevents her from drinking from a human. That's where a suicidal teen named Paul comes into the picture, and they both make a deal that to be beneficial for their needs. Humanist vampire seeking consenting suicidal person is an interesting and original take on the vampire subgenre. Despite its subject matter, it doesn't get too heavy. It stays close to a quirky, dark, offbeat comedy. The protagonists are endearing, likable, and are the beating heart of the film.
We have reached the end of our list with our final entry and our favorite movie of 2024, The Substance. It is incredibly inventive, dynamic, vibrant, and so disgusting. Now, when it comes to horror, what we usually get is a balance between the emotions of fear and disgust. And here, we really got the needle all the way up to disgust, which is, I think, the director's intention. Something she mentioned was that she did not want to be subtle with the movie's metaphor. And I usually dislike this approach, because a lot of movies that do that are overly blunt and lack narrative skill, and are more akin to a message being telegraphed than a story being told. But here I find it succeeded because the metaphor is both serving the message and the story. I like how the movie breadcrumbs the escalation into this absurd concept, how it creates the rules of the exchange between the young and old versions of the protagonist, how it executes the rules, and then how it transgresses it until we reach a monstrous point of no return. I like when a story is so off kilter that I can't even guess where it's heading narratively. And this is a weird comment, but I really like the sound design in this one. It was so unnecessarily detailed and off-putting, very imaginative and beautifully grotesque. This is a good example of how a body horror metaphor should be done. It can sit nicely next to one of my favorite movies, The Fly. This is a must-watch for body horror fans. And that's the end of our list. And I just want to say that we're very thankful for the people who watch our videos. And we've kind of taken a back seat because we've been a bit more busier in life, but this is still something very special to us that we like to keep maintaining, and we like to be able to make videos for, not just for us, but for other people. So another thing, I'm very thankful for the messages that were sent or that were left to us in our last video, and it is very encouraging. So what other horror movies you felt were really good that are not on this list? Also, what did you think of this format? Do you want more stuff like this? Anyway, here's to an even better horror movie year in 2025. Until next time.